Hi, uh, I will start then. I'm really delighted to be able to welcome Dr. Jennifer Howes for the second time to give her talk at the Society, because this is in fact a recording of the talk that she gave last week. But because we had problems with the Zoom connection, she very kindly agreed to do it again. So thank you, Jennifer, very, very much. So I'm going to hand over to Jennifer to tell us about the Story Tellers of Mysore and Tipu Sultan's female entourage. And it is a very interesting lecture, since I was lucky enough to hear it last week and look forward very much to hearing it again. So thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you very much for inviting me to give the talk again, which it will be better the second time around. So this lecture is about the hundreds of women who lived inside the palace of Tipu Sultan of Mysore and what happened to them following Tipu's death. Up until recently, historians have neglected to explore accounts of these women and have regarded any documentation about them as peripheral or irrelevant. About 4 years ago, I began exploring the documentation on these women inside colonial archives. They were placed under house arrest by the East India Company and exiled from Mysore Kingdom to Vellore Fort in Madras Presidency. Through this research, I've discovered that this obscure courtly community held power and influence that has gone unrecognized by historians. So this is a painting by Henry Singleton titled "The Last Effort and Fall of Tipu Sultan." Most Western accounts of India's imperial history are uninterested in the actions of women. Instead, they focus on military actions. In this painting by Henry Singleton, we see British and East India Company troops fighting the Mysore army at the siege of Srirangapatnam. It shows the frenzied final moments of Tipu Sultan's life on the 3rd of May, 1799, before he was killed by an anonymous British soldier. So you can see at the center of this painting, Tipu Sultan, he's the one who has a sword holding it back like that. And then there's a soldier in a red coat with a big hat who's about to kill him. More recent studies of the Fourth Mysore War look beyond military history and instead examine the dismantlement of Mysore Kingdom by the British after the siege of Srirangapatnam. For example, one area that relates to Mysore Kingdom's dismantlement, which is now attracting renewed attention, is the looting that occurred after Tipu Sultan's death and what happened to the objects and manuscripts that were taken away. Many of these looted items are now in Britain. So in this slide, on the left-hand side, we see one of the tiger head finials that was removed from Tipu Sultan's throne. This one was given to Henrietta Clive, the wife of Edward Clive, who was the governor of Madras at the time. And it is now in the National Trust's property at Powis Castle, and it has been written about in the National Trust's report on colonialism and historic slavery. Then the picture in the middle, this is a folio from the Sindbadnama, an illustrated Persian manuscript from Golconda that was in Tipu Sultan's library. It was sent to London in the early 19th century, and today it's in the British Library, And my colleague, the British Library's curator of Persian manuscripts, Ursula Sims-Williams, has been doing some excellent research and has published about the manuscripts from Tipu's library that are now in the British Library in London. And then the third picture on the right-hand side of this slide is Tipu's tiger, the famous automaton that you can see in the Victoria and Albert Museum today. It's been on public display pretty much continually since its arrival in London over 200 years ago, when it was first placed in the Oriental Repository of East India House. So all of these objects and more were looted from Srirangapatnam after the Fourth Mysore War. But what about the people of Tipu Sultan's court? What happened to them? So these are 4 portraits by Thomas Hickey of Tipu Sultan's elder sons. We know a fair amount about Tipu's sons. Following their capture in 1799, Hickey painted these portraits, and they were moved to Vellore Fort. Then, after the Vellore Mutiny of 1806, the sons were exiled again, this time to Calcutta, where they spent the rest of their lives. But what about their mothers and the other women of Tipu Sultan's inner court? They too were banished from Mysore and were sent away to Vellore Fort in the company-controlled territory of Madras Presidency. We know that in 1800, there were 601 female courtiers living inside the palace at Srirangapatnam. There is information about them in colonial archives, but this information has not been properly examined until now. So there's been little interest in exploring the women of Tipu Sultan's inner court in any depth whatsoever. And when they are mentioned in historical accounts, they are regarded as pretty unimportant. In British artworks, such as this picture, which is also by Henry Singleton, there are 2 women and they're effectively stage props. So this painting, well, this is a print based on a painting by Henry Singleton titled "The Body of Tipu Sultan Recognized by His Family." And it shows Tipu's body being mourned over inside of a palace by his courtiers and family members. So you can see there's a woman at sort of top center with her arm flung out, who's mourning his death. And then there's another woman at his feet who's clutching onto them. And they're both quite young, attractive ladies. At best, British accounts have described the women of Tipu's court as the voiceless victims who were rescued by the British from the clutches of a cruel tyrant. What I've discovered by looking into colonial archives is that many of these women were far from being passive victims. They surprised their new British masters with their willfulness and their ability to shape and inform public opinion against the East India Company. There's very little information about how these women lived in the 18th century before the Fourth Mysore War, while they were serving inside Tipu Sultan's court. Perhaps the most detailed documentation we have about their pre-British lives is a published account authored by a Frenchman. His name was Maestre de la Tour, and he was the commander-in-chief of Hyder Ali's artillery. Hyder Ali was Tipu Sultan's father. The title of his 2-volume book, which was translated into English in 1784, is The History of Hyder Ali Khan, as you see here. In Maestre de la Tour's book, he describes music and dance performances that he attended at Hyder Ali's court, giving us an idea of what at least some of these women were like and what their roles were. I'm now going to read out de la Tour's description of these women. And I quote, "Their habit is always a fine gauze, very rightly embroidered with gold, and they are covered with jewels. Their head, their neck, their ears, their breasts, their arms, fingers, legs, and toes have their jewels. And even their nose is ornamented with a small diamond that gives them an arch look, which is far from being unpleasing." De la Tour also described how these women operated and the performances they gave. And I quote, "The comedians of the court are all women. A directress," there she is, "a directress who is likewise manager, purchases young girls at the age of 4 or 5 years, who are chosen on account of their beauty. She causes them to be inoculated and then provides them with masters both for dancing and music. They are taught every accomplishment that can inspire the prince and his court with the love of pleasure, and their success is such they delight and seduce the most insensible of men. The comedies are all pieces of intrigue. They personate either women who league together to deceive a jealous husband, or young girls that conspire to deceive their mother. Their songs are gay and agreeable. The words that are sung by a single chorus, by a single voice, are almost always the complaint of a lover. Those which are sung in chorus are much gayer." And that's the end of the quote. So we know 2 important things from Maestre de la Tour's account of these performers, these female performers. First of all, we know that these performances were written and performed by women. And the second thing we know is that their storylines were about the misadventures of women and girls who tricked and deceived their superiors. This is important. This is another portrait by Thomas Hickey. It shows Thomas Marriott, the young man who was placed in charge of the women of Tipu Sultan's inner court in 1799. Thomas Marriott was an Orientalist scholar who was placed in charge of the women because of his skill in languages. He was probably about 26 years old when he was placed into this role. He authored a report in June 1800 about the women. He was instructed by his superiors to determine in this report whether any of them could be released from the palace, and to recommend how best to care for those women who had nowhere to go. This is a 2-page opening from Thomas Marriott's report, dated June 1800, about the women. The entire report is 10 pages long. So as an Orientalist, Marriott's report, Marriott's report categorized the women according to their rank. It completely lacks the descriptive detail that comes through in Maestro de la Tour's description of the courtiers who put on music and dance performances. But of course, the purpose of Thomas Marriott's report was different. He had been instructed to determine what to do with these hundreds of women. In particular, he had to establish whether any of them had families that they could return to. And then he had to decide the level of maintenance that the remaining women should receive. And as you can see here from the lists on this slide, the women at the top of the lists are the high status widows of Tipu Sultan and Hyder Ali. And then the women at the bottom of the list had more menial jobs. So they had to have different levels of provision to the women depending on their status. So the report also described where the women came from. So Marriott's report tells us that most of the 601 women came from Mysorean Hindu families. Others were from Delhi, Kashmir, Arcot, Hyderabad, and Tanjore. Some of the women were purchased as slaves, including women from as far away as Constantinople and Georgia. So the main division that is noted in these two folios is that half the women were from Tipu Sultan's private entourage, see, in Tipu Sultan's Mahal, and that the other half were from the entourage of Tipu's father, Hyder Ali. So at the top of the other page, it says Hyder's Mahal. These two separate entourages lived in two different areas of the palace at Srirangapatnam that were known as the Tipu Mahal and the Hyder Mahal. So the page on the left on this slide is a list of the women of the Tipu Mahal. The page on the right lists the women of the Hyder Mahal. And at the top of both of these lists, Marriott names, first of all, the high status wives of the two sultans. So you can see here in Tipu's Mahal, you have two wives. And then Hyder Mahal, there are three wives that are named. Below the wives, the next most important group of women in the palace were the first class unmarried women who performed music and dance programs to mixed audiences. So underneath the wives, you see first class of unmarried women. And then over this side, the women that Maestro de la Tour described in his account over 20 years before this report was compiled were the first class unmarried women of the Hyder Mahal. So over here you have first class of unmarried women under the Hyder Mahal. And so some of these 23 women would have been the same performers, or as de la Tour calls them, comediennes, that he described from Hyder Ali's court. So the first class unmarried women are referred to here as Gayan or Masrati. So you see here, unmarried women called Gayan or Masratis. Gayan is the word for singer. I don't know what Masrati means, but a colleague has suggested that this name could be derived from the Urdu word for joy. The term Masrati was used in future British reports to describe this particular group of first-class unmarried women. So below them, below the first class unmarried women, we have, surprise, the second class unmarried women known as conclavas. Here it is, second class of unmarried women called conclavas. And these women were, they privately entertained the king inside the palace. You see, it says appointed to attend the Sultan in his visits to the Mahal. And then below them are listed the women who performed infrastructural roles at court. So these were different kinds of cooks, nurses, seamstresses, messengers, dairy workers, sweepers, and so on. So Thomas Marriott's description of these 601 women is very much the work of an Orientalist. He classified them according to their status within the palace, and he noted down the numbers of slaves and attendants that served them. These numbers helped him denote their rank. So the wives have the most slaves per person, then the first class unmarried, they have roughly 2 to 3 slaves per woman, and so on. So whilst Marriott's report lacks the descriptive detail of Maistre de la Tour's account, it gives an overview of what all the women in the palace did, and it ranks them according to these different roles within a hierarchy. Marriott's account is also important because it shows that most of the women were not young. Obviously, there would have been beautiful young women at court, and this was the British stereotype. But nearly half of them were from the entourage of Tipu Sultan's father, Hyder Ali, who died in 1782. So some of the women of the Hyder Mahal would have been the mothers of Tipu Sultan's half-siblings. By 1800, many of the Hyder Mahal's residents would have been grandmothers, and some of them could have even been great-grandmothers. So now that we have a clear idea of what these women were, what they did at the Mysore court at Srirangapatnam, let's look at what happened to them when they were placed under East India Company custody. So Thomas Marriott, as mentioned before, he was told to reduce the number of women who lived in the palace, and he had to help organize their care and oversee their move from Srirangapatnam to Vellore, which happened in 1802. This is a map of Vellore Fort from the early 19th century. So inside Vellore Fort, 2 sets of apartments were constructed for the women. These were named the Tipu Mahal and the Hyder Mahal in imitation of the women's living quarters at Srirangapatnam. We know who designed the Mahals of Vellore. His name was John Goldingham, and he was an East India Company engineer. The locations of the Tipu Mahal and the Hyder Mahal are marked on this 19th century map as the harem, right here in the middle. And I believe even today, if you go to Vellore Fort, there are areas that are named, on archaeological survey maps as Tipu Mahal, Hyder Mahal. So this is the Tipu Mahal as it looks today. It was a prison in the 20th century, and it is now accommodation for trainee policemen. The East India Company arranged for these buildings to be constructed and set up the administration for the women's care at Vellore, but the funding for this didn't come out of the East India Company's coffers. This is another portrait by Thomas Hickey, and it is of Krishnaraja Wodeyar III, the new king of Mysore. So the funding for the women's maintenance at Vellore was paid by the newly appointed Wodeyar court of Mysore. Following Tipu Sultan's death, the East India Company identified the descendants of the Mysorean family that Tipu Sultan's father, Hyder Ali, had seized power from in the 1760s. And the company identified from this family who should be the heir to Mysore's throne. And here he is. He was about 5 years old. And he was crowned. Krishnaraja Wodeyar III was crowned on the 30th of June, 1799. So the kingdom that this child inherited was taxed by the East India Company to pay for all kinds of things. And one of these things was the maintenance costs for Tipu Sultan's exiled court and the construction and maintenance of the mahals inside of Vellore Fort. In 1802, when construction of the mahals at Vellore Fort was complete, the women were transported overland from Mysore Kingdom to Vellore. So they were moved from, you see on this map, Mysore is yellow, Mysore Kingdom is yellow, and then Madras Presidency, which is controlled by the East India Company, is pink, you know, the standard color of British rule. So Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, was the governor of Srirangapatnam at that time. And in his private correspondence, there are letters that reveal some unexpected problems with the moving of the women from Srirangapatnam to Vellore. So the mahals at Vellore Fort which were paid for by the Wodeyar Kingdom of Mysore, were completed in early 1802. And then the women were moved to Vellore in two groups. So they began with the Hyder Mahal. They were moved in May 1802. And then they were followed by the Tipu Mahal's women in June 1802. And before the move commenced, Thomas Marriott wrote a letter to Arthur Wellesley saying that of the original 601 women in the mahals, there were now 345 individuals to be moved, so a reduction of nearly half. So the arrangements for moving this reduced entourage seemed to be going well until the 9th of May, 1802, when Marriott wrote a letter saying that, unbeknownst to him, an additional 206 women had been smuggled into the mahals. 106 of them were in the Hyder Mahal, and he estimated another 100 were in the Tipu Mahal. In his letter, where he announces this unexpected increase in their numbers, he wrote, and I quote, "The only way I see of getting rid of them, except by force, is to dismiss them from the mahal whenever their mistresses die." So word of their increased numbers reached Vellore, where Thomas Dallas, the man who was in charge of receiving the women at the fort, he reacted by writing back the following to Thomas Marriott, and I quote, "You had better on the road down mention the impossibility of my receiving into the Mahals here any but those who were originally belonging to the Mahals at Seringapatam, as the extra women must have been introduced without our knowledge. So Thomas Dallas at Vellore, who hasn't met these women yet, was obviously expecting the women to obey a direct order from a man. It probably didn't cross his mind that the women would refuse to obey such an order. In any case, a few days later, Thomas Dallas's recommendations on how to handle the newcomers was revised. And in a letter he wrote to Arthur Wellesley, he said, and I quote, "I think they had better be allowed to remain, as discharging them would only cause dissatisfaction, which it may be as well to avoid." So that was the transport of the Hyder Mahal's women in May 1802. The women of the Tipu Mahal were then moved in June 1802. And on this second stage of the move, there's no discussion at all in the correspondence about sending away newcomers. So the difficulties with transporting the women, as recorded in the Wellington archives, show that the British men who were in charge of the move were taken aback by the women's recalcitrance. They were incapable of dealing with this behavior and decided it was easier to just let them have their own way. Thomas Marriott indicated that it was the Maserati women, the storytellers, these first-class unmarried women, who were the most forceful. It was they who insisted on bringing the 200 plus extra women from Srirangapatnam to Vellore, because, and I quote from a letter from Thomas Marriott, Tipu allowed all the first class or Maseratis 2 slaves each during his life. So one sense is that Marriott was taking orders from the women. In total, 583 women were moved from Srirangapatnam to the Mahals of Vellore Fort in May-June 1802. And then in the years immediately after their arrival at Vellore, the Mahal's population continued to increase. So by 1806, there were 790 individuals living in the Mahals of Vellore Fort, an increase of over 20% since the transport in 1802. And I should add here that the sons of Tipu Sultan, the heirs apparent of Mysore Kingdom, were also being held captive inside Vellore Fort. They were the sons of the women of the Tipu Mahal. And some of the older sons had entourages and children of their own. They were young adults. So their children were the grandchildren of the Tipu Mahal's women. So the fort at Vellore was crammed full with the most important surviving members of Tipu Sultan's court. So understandably, they were followed to Vellore by thousands of Mysorean citizens. This is a map from a guidebook. So this modern map shows the Mahals as the location of the police recruit school that I mentioned before. So this is where the Mahals are today. It also shows that there was only, or there is and was only one entrance to Vellore Fort. It's right here, this one entrance. And that it connects with the Petta district of Vellore, the market district of Vellore. You can see on this tourist map, this modern tourist map, that here's where the bus stand is. Over here, you have a covered market, you have a long bazaar street, a main bazaar street. It is still today very much a Petta district. And because of the Petta area's proximity to the fort's entrance, this was the most desirable area for Vellore's exiled Mysorean community to live. All the most powerful people who had moved to Vellore, such as family members and influential courtiers, wanted to live as close as possible to the sons and the women of Tipu's inner court. In August 1806, a colonial report counted 1,812 servants and adherents of Tipu Sultan as living permanently just in the Petta area of Vellore. And of course, there were far more Mysoreans living in other parts of the city. A recent study has estimated that about 6,000 Mysoreans moved to Vellore in the early 19th century. This means that the first-class unmarried Masorati women still had an audience for their performances, even though Tipu Sultan was long gone. They now gave performances to these thousands of exiled Mysoreans during feasts and festivals that were held inside the fort. The exiled Mysorean community at Vellore, nostalgic for their previous lives under Tipu's rule, would have been a receptive audience for these performances. I'm now going to look at the Vellore Mutiny of 1806. I'll begin by quickly summarizing its military events. So it began between 2 and 3 in the morning on the 10th of July, 1806, when the sepoys of the East India Company's Madras native infantry killed 14 officers and 115 men from the company's 69th Regiment. The rebels took control of the fort, raised the flag of the Mysore Sultanate, and declared one of Tipu Sultan's sons as their king. An officer escaped from Vellore and raised the alarm at another company garrison, and a relief force commanded by Captain Robert Rollo Gillespie was raised, and they arrived at Vellore later on that same day. Gillespie gave orders to kill any sepoys who stood in their way and executed those who had sought refuge inside Vellore Fort's palace buildings. In total, nearly 350 rebels were killed during the incident, but then further executions followed, with some mutineers being shot by firing squad or hanged, while others were blown apart after being strapped to the mouths of cannons. It was the largest sepoy uprising in the East India Company's history to precede the events of 1857. For over 200 years, historians have been debating the causes of the Vellore Mutiny. In the East India Company's court proceedings from Vellore, immediately after the mutiny, the causes were identified as, number one, the residence of the family of the late Tipu Sultan at Vellore, and number two, a change to the sepoy's uniform. So this second cause seems a little peculiar. Why would you mutiny over a uniform change? This picture shows part of an exhibition that was held in Vellore Fort's museum about the Vellore Mutiny, which featured mock-ups of some sepoy uniforms. If one looks carefully through the court proceedings at Vellore, there is frequent mention of the sepoys' uniforms, particularly their hats. One such account, recorded 2 months before the mutiny on the 10th of May, 1806, records that 2 havildars refused to wear a new turban-style hat because, and I quote, if they wore it, their caste would not supply them with water. 9 days later, so still before the mutiny, more complaints were lodged, this time by sepoys, claiming that, and I quote, their families would not live with them, nor would they prepare their rice for them, should they wear the new turban. Then after the mutiny, more testimonies were heard. One said that, and I quote, the thousands of adherents of Tipu's house assembled and uncontrolled in the populous Petta at Vellore will ever furnish powers to disseminate the most destructive tales. One sepoy testified that, and I quote, Tipu's people and the village people would not continue them in their caste or give them rice or water or let them have their daughters in marriage. So the problem wasn't so much the headgear or the uniform, it was the threat of what would happen to them if they wore it. These are all threats of domestic expulsion. Things like nobody's going to give you food and drink. Nobody will invite you to their house. Nobody will marry you. How were these destructive tales circulated? Let's go back to the women of the Mahals. In February 1806, the governor of Madras, William Bentinck, gave orders to cut back the allowances of all the women living inside Vellore Fort. And this would have been a huge affront to the women, particularly the Masratis, the first-class unmarried women whose lives were dedicated to the continuation of performance traditions and who expected a high level of maintenance. So between February and July 1806, that is after Bentinck's edict to cut the allowances and before the mutiny, 4 of Tipu Sultan's daughters were married inside Vellore Fort. So each of these weddings would have featured several days' worth of festivities inside the fort when the Masrati women of Tipu Sultan's court, who represented the mother's side of the family, would have performed their programs of music and dance. This slide is a night scene inside of Vellore Fort. You can tell by the buildings in the background, showing a Muslim wedding procession. So you can see there are fireworks going off and there are all these little torches. Now, I just want to draw your attention to the middle of this picture. You see there are these women in these red baskets. The next slide is a close-up of this part of the picture. So you can see there are the women in the baskets. And then down below, there are 3 women doing a performance. One of them has her arms like this. And they are surrounded by a crowd who are watching this performance. On the evening that the mutiny began, a notch was being held inside the fort to celebrate the wedding of Tipu Sultan's daughter, Nur ul Nisa Begum. Mere hours before the mutiny, 40 dances from the Tipu Mahal performed to the wedding guests inside the fort and remained there until after the mutiny. All 4 of the weddings that were held between February and July featured music and dance performances by the outspoken, first-class, unmarried Maharati women of the Tipu Mahal. The storylines of these performances were written and narrated by the women, and traditionally were about women deceiving their superiors. Was this where the destructive tales originated that prompted the sepoys to mutiny? Did the strong-minded first-class Maharati women cast the sepoys into their performances as the recipients of their tales of misbehavior? The women inside the Mahals were fully aware of the discontent that was brewing amongst the sepoys. In a sworn statement, Thomas Marriott wrote that a fire broke out in the Mahals on the night of the mutiny. When he went there the following day to make sure the women were uninjured, the mother of Prince Shukarullah approached him and said, "Marriott Sahib, did I not tell you what would be the consequence of making the sepoys disaffected?" After the mutiny, in August 1806, the sons of Tipu Sultan were exiled from Vellore to Calcutta. And by exiling them, the East India Company, perhaps inadvertently, punished the women of Tipu Sultan's inner court by separating them from their sons and their grandchildren. Any hope of fomenting another uprising against the British was put to rest. After 1806, the East India Company's reports on the women's treatment inside Vellore Fort become increasingly bureaucratic and perfunctory. So, for example, in 1821, a detailed report was compiled about the women who resided in the fort. It classifies them in a ledger according to the size of their allowances. They're ranked according to their status within the Tipu or Hyder Mahals in a payment system resembling the pay bands of soldiers or civil servants. It gives the names of the women and describes the table they are listed in as a muster roll. Muster roll here. That's a very British military term. So this section is this is the first few women listed on the Tipu Mahal muster roll. Of the 431 women named in this 1821 report, 52 of them were categorized as Maharati women, the storytellers, the comedians of Maître de la Tour's accounts. To the East India Company, this title, Maharati, was now an administrative categorization. It was no longer a description of their role within Tipu's court. In spite of this bureaucratization, the Maharati women continued to occasionally assert their will over the East India Company. For example, on one occasion in 1820, they walked out of the fort demanding their allowances be increased. They remonstrated by invoking the names of Thomas Marriott and Arthur Wellesley, claiming that those men knew how to properly arrange their treatment as per their lives under Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan. One suspects that the women were insulting the men who were arranging their care at that time, the ones who took over from Marriott and Wellesley. Their protest of 1820 was, it appears, unsuccessful. However, the Maharati women continued to entertain Vellore's Mysorean community, offering them a conduit to the past. Their presence inside Vellore Fort was mentioned in colonial reports right up until the late 1850s. Now, this is a company painting from Vellore of a holy procession, and it is now in the British Library. And I wanted to show this because I'm just gonna, with my pointer, I'm gonna circle this bit here. And now I'm going to do a close-up of that area so you can see there are the women. There they are. And I put this other company painting of these three performers on the other side. So you can see they're dressed the same way. They're wearing the same kind of jewelry. So in conclusion, is it far-fetched to implicate the Masorati women of Tipu Sultan's inner court into the events of the 1806 mutiny? No, it's not. A key role in South Asian courts, or in any court for that matter, has always been for women to uphold the family line and to influence matters of succession. The most obvious way for a female courtier to raise her status was by having a son and situating him into a position of power. Another key role of these court women was to work as entertainers. Nearly half of the women inside the Tipu and Hyder Mahals of Srirangapatnam in 1800 were either entertainers or the servants of entertainers. They were the storytellers of Tipu's court, and they used the domestic powers that fell under their authority to improve their lives. Historians have overlooked documentation about the women of Tipu Sultan's court because it has been regarded as irrelevant. However, when the women's actions are contextualized alongside the historical events they lived through, one realizes that they were perfectly placed to spawn political discontent by scripting and disseminating narratives of their choosing. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Jennifer. That was wonderful. It was really very good to hear it again. I was delighted because I was able to actually concentrate a bit more and not worry so much about the Zoom going down. So I don't know if perhaps we have a small audience. Perhaps maybe one of them would like to ask a question, and we can unmute you if you would like that. Ah, right. Dr. Khan, I think.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, sure, we can. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. And it was such a wonderful and inspiring information. And I must tell you that I actually live less than 5 kilometers from this spot, the Tipu and Hyder Mahal. I live in Vellore.
Yes.
And I'm an architect. I live in New Zealand, but I've migrated there. So Vellore is my hometown. So I'm here right now teaching architecture. Vellore has always been my interest, and I have documented many of these buildings here, especially the Tipu family's tombs, and also the 1806 mutiny. British officers' cemetery has been documented by me. And one thing is that there's a lot of things that comes up because in my involvement here, I haven't really gone that deeper into the historical facts because we don't have access to information here. And Vellore is a small library, and it doesn't have all that except that the gazetteer, district gazetteer, which is used here, doesn't contain much of information. I think there's a lot more to what Jennifer has been talking about. It's so interesting. In fact, when I read her article, I'm sort of like revived, and I became alive. I said, okay, there is somebody talking about my area of interest, and and it will be wonderful to go a little more deeper into the records and see what has happened in many things, especially the 350 men or the sepoys or the mutineers who were killed. Where are they buried? That is one big question. And the second thing is that there is there's a hell of a lot of tombs, which I have documented a few of them, about 20, 25 of them, the Tipu's family. So we need to actually identify whose tombs are these. Probably we can work together and find out. And also, there is no mention of John Craddock. Have you heard of this man?
I have.
I think this is the man who was in charge of the sepoys, and at the time of the mutiny. And but I think I don't know what happened to him. Did he die, or because I don't find his tomb here? But we do find one particular tomb of a captain or Colonel Fancourt. I was told that he is a very important person, so I have listed him. And unfortunately, most of these tombs have been displaced by a church, a new building which has come up. Total disregard to the heritage of this town. As a child, I used to visit this fort, and I used to see a lot of things, especially those, what do you call that, the cages where prisoners or the convicts were killed or alive, and they were hanged in public, or they were displayed in public. What do you call them? There's a special name for it. I'm not getting that name. So they actually put one Hindu and a Muslim there to scare, because after the mutiny, they expected some sort of further rebellion. So they wanted to scare the public. So they put these two people, because the mutiny happened by both the Hindus and the Muslims together. Because in your pictures, you can see there's a lot of Hindu musicians in that paintings, and it's so interesting to see that you also mentioned that many of those people who came from Srirangapatnam were Hindus, who are part of the entourage. So it's an absolutely fascinating talk, and I love to come to England to look into this. I remember meeting one gentleman named Farrington in British Museum long time back. It must be 20 years back. I wanted to donate my drawings. I still have a lot of about 150 drawings. I probably wanted to give it to somebody so that they can preserve it, maybe to the School of Oriental and African Studies. I'd like to gift them or something of that sort, because I don't think nobody will ever sort of maintain them here. There's no proper archival arrangements. So it's a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it, and I definitely would like to work with Royal Asiatic Society. I'm trying to become a member there, but I'm not able to pay my membership fee because of whatever reason the system is not working there. So, and it'll be wonderful, and it's fantastic. And thank you very much for enlightening. I don't know how many of us are from Vellore. Here I see a few names, but I don't know. But it was a wonderful thing. I think I'll definitely be having more discussions with Jennifer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's so encouraging that people are this. I knew this was an interesting topic, and I'm glad that it connects with other people's work.
We've got another question from Shalva. Could you unmute? Could we unmute you? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just bowled over. It's so fascinating, and you present it so well with those beautiful pictures, and you're basically rewriting history, bringing women into the reconstruction of colonial history, and I really take my cap off to you. It was really brilliant. I just, because I'm ignorant of most of the subject, I just wanted to ask you, when you use the images, where are they all from? Because they're gorgeous, they're so rich. But I have one connection to this subject. I have a legend in the people that I study that they were saved by Tipu Sultan's mother. Now, is it 100% sure that Tipu Sultan's mother was Fatima Fakra Nisa? Is that a sure fact? I'm asking you as an expert on this field. And also, do we have pictures of her?
No. Unfortunately, I know very little about Tipu's mother, mainly because she was already deceased when the East India Company laid siege to Srirangapatnam in 1799. So there isn't really any mention of her in these colonial records that I've gone through. I mean, maybe there is something in Maestre de la Tour. I haven't, that's on Google Books, so that might be a good place to check. As for the pictures that I've shown, the company paintings that I've shown are all from Vellore. They were painted, there are 2 albums of these company paintings from Vellore from the 1830s. One is in the British Library and the other one is owned by a private collector. And I've been able to look at both of these albums, and I looked through them really because they're very much a document of these exiled Mysoreans from Tipu's Mysore. You see lots of pictures of these women, and then there are pictures of all variety of tradespeople and so on. So it's something that I've only just explored a little bit, and I want to look at a bit more.
Okay, so the story that I know that I'm referring to definitely takes place in 1795. When presumably Tipu Sultan's mother is alive still, unless they messed it up, the oral history.
Yeah.
And we know this for a fact because of what happened afterwards in the story. I won't go into it because it's not my lecture, but so 1795, she was presumably, this Fatima lady was presumably alive.
I guess so. I don't know when Tipu Sultan's mother died off the top of my head, I'm afraid.
Okay.
But it's yeah, I guess it's likely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
I think that you're just the beginning of a whole movement of putting women back into history. And also, of course, what you present is potentially dangerous because soon people will be knocking on your doors to ask where all these artifacts are, and they'll want them back in Vellore. So we'll wait for that backlash.
Yeah, but we'll see. Yeah,
we'll see. I don't think we'll be alive then, probably.
Yeah. Thank you.
Right. I don't know if we have any more questions. I think that's it. So, Dr. Khan would like to say something. Yes.
Sorry, I'm coming back again, especially about Fakhr-un-Nisa. Fakhr-un-Nisa is mentioned in many of historical narratives, and there's a story which says that Hyder Ali, he did not believe in saints, so he came all the way from Kolar or Srirangapatnam, and he was stationed at a place called Hyderpuram, which is very closer to Vellore, and they visited a saint called Tipu Aulia, who's in Arcad, part of the Carnatic region, and his tomb is still there. So it seems that the dead lady was blessed with a son, or the saint prayed for her, or whatever it is, and the name Tipu was given from this particular Tipu saint. But the saint is still there, his tomb is still there, beautifully built, it survived. But never ever send those artifacts back to India. So please keep them there, they're safe, and perhaps like Shalva says, that we could probably build a museum for Tipu Sultan in London, and that would be a great tribute.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's not my decision where these things belong, but it is. It's good that we are open-minded and talk about these things, that people are aware of where they are now.
Well, I think that draws us to the end of the talk, and thank you very much, Jennifer. I mean, there is something on the chat here from Sheila. thank you very much for a really interesting presentation. So there we go. Right.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Alison. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jennifer. It was very good and lovely images as well. Really brought the ladies to life. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everybody. Bye. Thank you.